the Doralicious Show.
Welcome back to the Doralicious Show, and I'm very excited to have the negotiator Fotini Iconomopoulos here on the Doralicious Show for a second time to talk about her new book, Say Less, Get More, which is going to be the hottest book in town. Fotini mo, kalos ites. Welcome to the Doralicious Show.
Thank you. It's so nice to be back with you.
Can you believe it was a year ago, the first time that we chatted?
Almost to the day. It's insane how circumstances have changed and yet not changed at all at the same time.
Well, the biggest change for you is your new book, Say Less, Get More. Congratulations.
Yeah. Thank you. It's finally available. It feels like it's been forever since I started writing this.
How long ago did you start writing?
I started writing it at the beginning of 2019, and I finished writing it in February of 2020. So I put it to bed in February 2020, and then the pandemic hit.
Puna Ixeres, what was coming when you were writing this book?
Well, and the funny thing is I was saying no to all of these gigs and opportunities with clients in January, February, and pushing them all out to March. And I was like, yeah. And in the spring, I'll loads of time in the spring. I've got to finish this editing stuff. And then it all just completely went upside down.
So I've had the pleasure of actually getting my hands on your book, an ebook, and reading about the different techniques of negotiation. So let's start with the title. Why say less, and how do you get more?
So there's two things that does for you. First of all, literally, when you say less in a negotiation, studies show us time and time again that the people who say less are actually the ones that get better results. So even though we watch these movies with fast talking Wall Street type guys and the shows like Suits, that's not how the best deals are actually done. And so even though people think I've got to be quick on my feet, I've got to learn how to, respond faster, my message is no, you don't. Introverts can rejoice because you can actually be really effective by saying a lot less. And then the other thing that comes from it is by saying less, it means you're taking your time to think. You're taking your time to think things through and allow the rational thought to come back into your brain. Because when we are faced with stressful moments, that's when we have these physiological responses to stress. The same way our cave person ancestors would have had a response to a saber-toothed tiger, they would have had this superhuman strength to run away from it because all of the energy basically left your brain and went to your limbs. Today, we don't have those same physical threats, but we have psychological threats, but our brain responds the same way. So my message is say less, take a moment to pause, take a moment to allow the rational thought to come back when your heart starts to race and when your palms start to get sweaty and your breathing starts to get a little bit more shallow. Take your time to take a meditative breath, and you're going to get a lot more out of those situations. So it's literal and figurative all at the same time.
I love it. There's something to be said about the Spartan way. Nice laconicos, be very laconic, say a few things to get more. So there's a transition now in a more of a scientific approach in what our ancestors used to say.
Well, my mother is Spartiatissa, so I guess it makes sense. I've got the Laconian blood in me.
And in one of your very first pages, you write, and I quote, our role models belong to a privileged group who aren't subjected to the same repercussions. Thus, they operate with no fear. That spoke to me. I remember I was doing a training session with one of our managing partners, and he told me, when you go to court, be this aggressive. And that did not work for me. One, he was a senior counsel in his 70s, white, who has a name already in the industry. And that, let me just tell you, did not go well with me.
Yeah.
It's crazy. It's crazy to read that on paper and just experience it.
Yeah, and in the book, I think I start out with a very similar experience where, I was watching other people do what I do, but they forgot that, and I forgot that I was 10 to 15 years younger than all of my peers when I was training all of these global executives. I was the only female who was doing it at the time, and all I did was mimic what they did, and it just didn't work. And I intuitively, I understood why, but for years I've been reading more about behavioral science and reading more about specifically negotiation and gender. And I went, oh, this is why it didn't work, because we respond differently to different groups, because what works for the majority doesn't necessarily work for the minority. And so even when I read some of the best-selling books on negotiation, I love so many of them. There's a lot of really great stuff out there, but I always look at many of them and go, yeah, 80% of that works for me. The other 20% would never work because I'm not white, a male. I don't have an FBI badge on me. I don't have the extra gray hairs on my head. All of those things just don't work. So we have to be mindful of who is the person who is saying these words, and also who is the person who's receiving it. Because it's going to sound really different with me speaking to somebody in my peer group versus me speaking to somebody who is more senior, more older, wiser, experienced, and so on. I've been called little girl at work before. It did not go over well. But I have to be mindful of there's going to be those people out there. So how am I going to handle it? What am I going to say specifically to respond when those things happen?
And do you find the difference between other negotiation books and your book is that accounting for different factors?
I'd like to believe so. I mean, I use the analogy in my world, and I think I say it in the book, of it's the stairs versus the on ramp. And the stairs works for the vast majority of people. That's why stairs exist everywhere. But the on ramp works for everybody. The on ramp catches all of those people who can't make use of those stairs. And so my goal for this book is to be the on ramp. If it works for me as somebody who is not male, who is a lot younger, who looks ethnic no matter where I go, who has a name that people can't pronounce, which is challenging in its own right, if it can work for somebody like me, it can work for somebody like someone else who has their own set of challenges that they go along with. That's the goal, that's the mission, to make it as inclusive as possible.
Λοιπόν, Φωτεινή μου, πάμε σε ένα διαλυματάκι and we'll be back because I have a few more questions to ask you about your top 3 negotiation skills in relationships or in the professional environment. So we'll be back here on the Doralicious show with Fotini Iconomopoulos featuring her new book, Say Less, Get More. So what are your top 3 negotiation skills for personal and professional lives?
Well, whether you're negotiating in life or in business, I would say the number one is always to shut up. Right? That's where the title of the book comes from. It's Say Less. Shutting up not only can help you collect your thoughts, but it can make sure that you actually can look far more credible. And so the number two, I would say, is show up how you want to be perceived. And so in the book, I mentioned things like power poses and body language. I tell women especially to not sit at the back of the room. I want you to sit at the front. I want you to walk in like you own the joint. I got a lot of attention early in my career because I wasn't afraid of sitting at the front of the room, because I walked in wearing a bright red dress in a sea of dark suits. I owned my presence. And when you can do that and you layer in the silence on top of that, that can be a recipe for just magic. And I would say the last thing I would advise people is prepare. And that means thinking about things before you go in. You know, I've had those difficult circumstances where I've been called little girl. It wasn't a shock. It wasn't a surprise. So when that moment happened, instead of going, oh crap, what do I do? What do I say? I could anticipate that moment and I knew exactly how I would handle it. It was a little less shocking to my brain, so my rational thought didn't entirely disappear. But I also tell people, even if it's a salary negotiation, practice those words, practice the proposal coming out of your mouth so that they're not coming out for the very first time when you're under the most pressure. You'll have a little bit of muscle memory in your tongue to make sure that you're not stumbling over it. And the same is true whether you're at home. When you're dealing with a toddler, you can probably anticipate how they're going to react to a lot of stuff. So what are you going to have ready? How are you going to manage some of those things? We can predict so much of what happens in those stressful situations. So spend the time preparing and life will be a lot easier for you.
It's like, think of the worst case scenarios and then hopefully they don't happen, but you're prepared for them.
Well, when you think of the worst case scenarios, I would say it goes a step further. You can prevent them, right? Because if you can think of that worst case, what can I do to prevent it from going there? And that's precisely what I do when I'm working with clients. So I get hired to help people through high stakes negotiations. When a global retailer is breathing down their neck, or a merger is about to happen, or it seems very combative and there's $100 million on the line, that's when people call me in. And most of my time is spent going, okay, what's the worst that could happen? All right, if we know that could happen, what would prevent that from happening? And if it happens anyway, what are we going to do to rectify the situation? So it's really just so much predicting and planning that I help people with.
And I have to tell you, you were talking on your Instagram about a technique. If I do this, then, and it worked. I used that with my dad, who's a very stubborn man. And I said, well, if you do this for me, daddy, I will do your accounting. And then magically, it just happened. No griña, no arguments. It just happened.
That's music to my ears. And I'm telling you, I have practiced this with my big fat Greek dad as well. I really think I dedicated the book to my family because I know that I wouldn't be doing what I do if they hadn't forced me to practice negotiating just to get out of the house when I was younger. So if it works on my big fat Greek family, I guarantee it'll work with others as well.
Do you find your family was actually harder to negotiate versus CEOs of big corporations?
Oh, 100%. I mean, dealing with a Greek dad with a very short temper. I mean, if I could work there, the CEO stuff is super easy.
It's kindergarten at that point.
Oh, absolutely.
And I want to ask you, because I get that a lot, and especially in certain fields such as law, being a lawyer, we see that with negotiation, right? You talk about negotiation, that you give concessions, there's kind of a win-win for both sides, someone takes, someone gives. But how do you deal with parties who have given, they've also taken, but they're not happy?
Well, I usually what happens is the reason they're not happy is something that you have done. It's
Mhm.
something in your behavior, right? So I talk in the book, I think it's in one of the later sections of the book, where I talk about the choreography of satisfaction. So I'll give you an example. So Walmart Canada is a place where I spent a lot of time in my jobs before I went into negotiation training, and I've also obviously worked with a lot of companies who spend time in those walls. And one of the ways it's set up is when you walk out of the building, you actually walk past the cafeteria. So all of those Walmart employees, like the buyers and so on, could be sitting there having a coffee, watching the vendors, the manufacturers walk out. And too many times I have seen those folks walk out and they're high-fiving each other and they have these big giant smiles on their faces. So if I see you walk out and you look like you're thrilled, if I'm that buyer watching from the cafeteria, how do you think I'm feeling? I'm going, oh, if they're happy, that means I gave them too much. And that means that's making me unhappy.
Mhm.
Versus if they'd walked out going, that was really tough, then I'm going to feel so much more satisfaction because it looks like I got everything I possibly could out of you. So it really has a lot to do with human behavior when it comes to that happiness factor, whether they're too happy or not happy enough. That's so much of that is on you. It's like when you're dealing with children and you're going, you clean that up all by yourself? No way. And they feel so proud of themselves and they puff out their chest. It's the way you just delivered it, where you could have ignored it and gone, yeah, that's what you're supposed to do. Duh. But they're not going to feel very much satisfaction out of that. So we play it up all the time. We do this choreography with children in our lives all the time. I know that as a Thea and as a Nuna and all of those things, but we need to think about those same feelings that we're evoking out of people. Negotiation is not done on a spreadsheet. If it was, I wouldn't have a job today. We're not rational creatures. We don't depend on formulas. It is done because we are driven by our emotions. And you personally are responsible for that other person's emotions. You can change how they feel based on what you say and how you say it. And that's, again, it leads back to the title of the book. It's Say Less, Get More, right? So you can think very carefully about what are you going to say to get more out of this situation and help make them feel like they got more out of it.
I love it. Λοιπόν, πάμε σε ένα άλλο διαλυματάκι and we'll be back. And I want you to tell us, when we come back, where do you see Say Less, Get More go? Where do you see it in the future? So we'll be back here on the Doralicious Show with Fotini Iconomopoulos. And we're back with Fotini Iconomopoulos, her new book, Say Less, Get More, which it's coming out April 20th, but don't forget, you can always pre-order it on major platforms. I'm not going to name them, but follow Fotini on Instagram or Facebook, and she has all that information. Λοιπόν, Fotini μου, Say Less, Get More. Where do you see it going? What's the future?
My hope for it is that it becomes a movement. So, for those of you who are on Clubhouse, which is an audio app, I started a Say Less, Get More club there, which means I'm not the only one who's going to be running rooms on it. If you think of Lean In, that's probably the easiest parallel I can drive. So, Lean In became a movement amongst women. Say Less, Get More is more than just for women, it's for everybody. But it became this movement where people went, yeah, I want to lean in. How do I do that? I'm going to surround myself with people who are interested in also doing the same thing. Many people who are in lean in circles or attend lean in events have never even read the book, and some have never heard of Sheryl Sandberg before. And so it's not about, I feel like this is not about me, it's about the movement. How do we get people thinking more and saying less? So how do we create these dialogues with people? I hope that people buy the book and start a book club or start coaching each other. People tell me all the time when they're in a keynote or something, can I share this with someone? I'm like, share it. Yeah, spread it like wildfire, because it means we're going to help more people. We're going to help more people feel empowered. And we're also going to help people have better conversations, right? How amazing would it be if everybody you talked to were saying less in those conversations? Because if you're saying less, you're being a more active listener. If you're saying less, you're being more mindful of the people around you. So I just think we're going to have better conversations and a better community if we can adapt some of these practices. So my hope is that it's far bigger than just a book. It just becomes part of everybody's mantra for every day.
I love it. I'm already starting to adopt it in my everyday negotiation at work or with my family.
Yeah, like I said, you can say less and get more in life, and you can say less, get more in business as well.
And I think that's one of the key points that you make in the book, that negotiation is everywhere. Why do you think people are so afraid of, not afraid, but like concerned with the word negotiation? Katikani ke pafenune when they hear it.
It is fear. I think you've nailed it. And it is one of those things where it's associated, like if I say the word salesman, you go, ugh, slimy, right? That's just the connotation that goes along with it. We have to detach ourselves from those connotations because there's some wonderful salespeople out there. And it's the same way with negotiation. It doesn't have to be a bad word. But when we think of it, again, what's depicted in movies and what's depicted in the media and so on, is you think about that Donald Trump banging his fist on a table type of scenario. And that's the rarest of negotiations in my world. And I deal with some pretty high stakes scenarios. People assume it's going to be a tough boxing match. And I guarantee nobody I've ever dealt with has ever had a broken nose. And so
Yes.
it's thinking about the fact that we negotiate all the time. If I'm getting on public transit, I am negotiating for my physical space without even saying a word. I'm going to stand a different way to make sure I take up more space. That's a negotiation. If you're walking your dog and you're pulling on its leash, that's a negotiation. You're trying to get it to do something you want it to do. And that's not toxic. But for some reason, we only associate it with those more toxic scenarios. And that's what creates that fight or flight moment in our brains. And that fight or flight means I'm going to overreact to something. I'm going to fight and I'm going to get very defensive, or I'm going to flee and I'm going to leave altogether. So my hope is that coming out of reading this book, the word negotiation is synonymous with an opportunity instead of a fight or combat.
I like that. It's an opportunity to get more at the end of
Yes.
the day. Λοιπόν, Fotini, πριν σε αφήσω, what do you have to tell to people out there that have struggled during COVID? What's the one negotiation skill that they should adopt for their work environments right now?
Ooh, for COVID specifically, I would say the one negotiation skill I think has been the most handy, because I've been helping a lot of people manage. I mean, I've been helping nurses negotiate for safer conditions. I've been helping people manage to negotiate their rent and not get evicted. And so much of that comes from two things. It's going in with a mindset of curiosity. So how much does this person know about the circumstances that I'm going to talk to them about? Instead of making assumptions and getting defensive, be curious about this person. And along with that curiosity, then I want you to ask questions. And you can be in charge of the conversation by asking really great questions, but you're going to be perceived as more assertive instead of aggressive. So you can get what you want. I have a whole section on the book on it, but you can get what you want by asking questions without being labeled bitchy or greedy or aggressive or any of those things. So think really carefully about how you want to approach this conversation. Do it with curiosity and have some specific questions ready to make them feel like they're engrossed in a conversation with you, instead of having to deal with you being very aggressive and demanding in that moment. If they feel like they're part of the solution, then they're going to want to help you find a way to work together more effectively, whether it's renegotiating working from home or negotiating flexibility or negotiating a different workload or whatever it is. You and they are going to be far more resilient if you can have conversations versus exhausting each other by going into combat.
I like that. I like that. And Fotini, where can people find you and where can they pre-order the book?
So you can find me on LinkedIn, where I share lots of articles and nuggets on negotiation. I do the same thing on Instagram, where it's at Fotini Icon, because I don't want to confuse people who have difficulty with my last name. You can go to my website, which is fotiniicon.com as well. And the book is available for order almost everywhere. So Amazon, Indigo if you're in Canada, Barnes and Noble if you're in the US. There's retailers all over the world. We found people buying it in Singapore, in Australia, in France. So yeah, just search online and you will find it almost anywhere.
Συγχαρητήρια και σου εύχομαι one day that it will be translated in Greek to make Yaya proud as well.
I certainly hope so.
Λοιπόν, Φωτεινή μου, I really want to thank you for your time, your energy, and your skills for bringing that out there and making us better a day at a time.
Thank you very much for having me. It's so great always to chat with you.
Bye, Φωτεινάκη μου, bye.